Today we're going to cover invoice against contract. I'm going to break this into 5 separate videos to downsize it into more palatable sizes. The first will be an overview. The second will be the options and flexibility of invoice against contract. The third will be the auto invoice and evaluated receipt settlement. Then we'll roll into receiving options. And then the last video will be a demo of the setup and configuration. So let's talk about receiving versus invoice approvals versus directly paying. So receiving on a invoice against contract functions the same as a normal receipt. You have a RC. It follows the standard approval process unless you've set up a special one for contracts, but it keeps a running tally of the total number received. And so it doesn't process a invoice against a receipt. It keeps a tally running effectively where it's going to say you've received 100, you've been invoiced for 100, it pays. You receive 20 more, they invoice for 30. It goes, well, you've got invoices for 130, you've only received 120, we're going to hold that invoice. However, when the next shipment comes in and you receive 10 more, it's going to release that invoice and hold the next. And so it can be a little problematic using receiving on these, but it does have invoice exception types tied to this so that it will hold the invoices at some point. And so you're not going to issue an overpayment, but you may pay an incorrect invoice where it should have been short paid, but ultimately you will be able to short pay one of the invoices. So because of that, many customers choose to go with the invoice approval, which is effectively the same. It's just work transformation. It's the same validation. When an invoice comes in, you route it to the requester and say, did you receive these goods or services? And it's simply done on the IR document versus the receipt. It's not a full financial approval of the invoice. It's simply a work validation step. Many of the invoice against contracts are set up for services and not goods. And in general, people understand approving invoices for that type of work versus doing receiving. Receiving, people think of receiving physical goods. I received 10 widgets. I need to go receive 10 widgets. They don't think this guy worked 40 hours this week. I need to go receive 40 hours. And so for that reason, the invoice seems to be a little better. As well, for a lot of the project-based spend, etc., this allows a final coding and expense check. Whereas if you're doing receiving, a lot of times that invoice matches and it will go through just like the standard through match. It matches the contract, it matches the receipt, and it pays, versus using the invoice as the receipt or validation of goods. It allows them to check that accounting coding one last time before they process it. And then finally, direct pay. And so this is the auto invoice function. This is where it will automatically go directly into payment status, assuming you have no additional approvals. And so all of your upfront financials are approved. I have $1 million contract. I'm going to pay them, $200,000 for the next 5 years. You obtain all of that financial approval on the contract before signature. At that point, you make sure the GL information is provided up front. You enter it into the line items. And this is really used when receipts and approvals just slow down the process. It adds less or more labor, which makes the process less efficient. And you can always add a watcher to the IR document if you want to notify people when this is occurring.
Wanted to give you a little bit more background on the receiving on invoice against contract and some of the pitfalls of it. So let's say that we have a contract for 1,000 units. So we have our contract, and it's for 1,000 units. The first actual physical goods receipt, right? So the let's say the ship notice, the ASN, Advanced Ship Notice, is for 50 units. We receive in 50 units. The invoice comes in for 50 units. Okay, so I've got a contract for 1,000, a ship notice for 50, receipt for 50, and invoice for 50. Ultimately, I will yield a payment for 50. Right. Second shipment comes in. So they send us a ship notice with 50. We actually only receive 40. Invoice comes in for 50. Ultimately, we hold the payment, right? So this is a hold. So right now, our cumulative is 190 we won't go into the advanced ship notice. So what happens though is when the next shipment, so the next shipment, maybe the next day, the next week comes in for a unit of 50, we receive in 50 for a total of 140 now. They invoice us for 50 for a total of 150. Ultimately, when this receipt comes in, it actually comes over here and clears the second invoice. You'll make a payment for the second 50, and now this third invoice is on hold. And so it will continue to do this, which can be a problem because again, now when the fourth shipment comes in, they ship 50, they ship 50, you receive in 50 for a total of 190 now. They invoice for another 50 for a total of 200. This invoice is now released. So that's released, you pay for 50, and this is now on hold. Now, tracking this can be very difficult because now you're actually looking at an invoice reconciliation for the fourth invoice when really the shipment issue was on the second shipment and second invoice. And so for that reason, it can be very tricky. This is why we traditionally see individuals running a back-end verifier on the invoice or the IR document, invoice reconciliation document, instead of running receiving on the invoice against contract approval.
Thank you for the time today.